The year is 939, somewhere on the eastern borders of the Holy Roman Empire. The Saxon Margrave Gero is throwing a grand feast. He invites 30 Slavic chieftains. These are men with whom his forces have waged an exhausting border war for years. This is presented as a gesture of reconciliation, a promise of good neighborliness and lucrative trade. The Slavs arrive. They sit at the tables, drink wine, and listen to speeches about a new peace. Their weapons are left at the entrances. Such are the ancient laws of hospitality. When the chieftains are drunk and relaxed, Gero gives the order. The doors are barred shut. Armed German guards storm into the hall. Not a single one of the 30 Slavic princes made it out of that feast alive. This isn't a scene from a dark fantasy novel. This is a documented historical fact, and it is absolutely everything you need to know about the rules of the game in Central Europe in the mid-10th century. The Holy Roman Empire was moving inexorably eastward. It carried the cross, civilization, and the law. But for those who stood in its path, this law meant only one thing. You can be deceived, you can be slaughtered, and your lands can be taken, because you are pagans. You exist entirely outside the rules. At this exact time, slightly further to the east, in the dense primeval forests between the Oder and Vistula rivers, a young boy is growing up. His name is Mieszko. He was not at that feast. His tribe, the Palances, still too far from the reach of Germanic swords. But he is the one destined to inherit this brutal world. A world where, every spring, ironclad horsemen might cross the river to burn your home to the ground and drag your people away to the slave markets of Europe. Mieszko will go down in history as the first historically verified ruler of Poland, the man who would force the empire to reckon with him. Founders of states are usually painted as idealists, as heroes with burning eyes who unite tribes through the power of divine revelation or a grand sweeping dream. Forget all of that. Mieszko was a pragmatist. He had zero illusions regarding his neighbors. He watched German margraves grind Slavic tribes into dust, one after another. He understood perfectly. If he kept playing by the old traditions, his people were doomed. To survive, he would have to become more dangerous and far more cunning than the men coming to kill him. This story is not about spiritual enlightenment, nor is it a tale of wild tribes suddenly awakening to the beauty of civilization. This is a story about sheer survival, about how a state transforms into a heavy, sometimes utterly ruthless machine, grinding up even its own ancient traditions for one single purpose: to avoid being wiped off the map. We are used to perceiving the conversion of an entire nation to a new religion as some sort of sacred holy act. But for Mieszko, faith became a weapon, an instrument of hard geopolitics, a shield he forged to stop the imperial steamroller dead in its tracks. He will have to cut deals with former bitter enemies, abandon the gods to whom his ancestors prayed for centuries, force his people to pay crushing taxes, and watch his warriors hack each other to death in a narrow gorge above the Oder, defending their very right to exist. Now picture 10th century Europe. In the west, the empire of Otto the Great is gathering its strength. To the south, in Bohemia, sits the brilliant and ruthless Prince Boleslaus the Cruella, man who murdered his own brother for the sake of power. And right in between them lies a vast expanse covered in primeval forest, inhabited by dozens of fractured, disunited Slavic tribes. These tribes have no central authority, no stone fortresses, no written language, but they do possess something highly valued in the markets of Prague, Magdeburg, and even far-off Baghdad: slaves. Pagan Europe is the primary supplier of human merchandise for the Christian and Islamic worlds. If you are unbaptized, you can legally be slapped in chains. That is the economy of the era. It's nothing personal. Mieszko faced an impossible task. From a loose conglomerate of forest tribes accustomed to living by their own fragmented laws, he had to assemble a single, unified force, a machine capable of fielding thousands of professional, full-time warriors. If you really think about it, he didn't stand a chance. He was supposed to become just another nameless victim at just another feast of some margrave. But he outplayed them all. Forget modern borders. Forget the word Poland. In the mid-10th century, none of that exists. If you were to look down from above at the territory between the Oder and Vistula rivers, you would see an almost continuous, impenetrable green ocean, primeval forest, swamps, rivers that serve as the only truly safe highways. In this sprawling forest, there are no stone castles, no paved roads, no universal law. Dozens of Slavic tribes live here. In the south, along the flow of the Vistula, sit the Vistulans. In the northwest, closer to the sea and the Germanic lands, dwell the Velitior Lutici. They are ferocious pagans, fanatically devoted to their gods, who strike terror into the hearts of even battle-hardened Saxons. And right in the center, on plains cleared from the forest for arable farming, lives the tribe of the Polans, the people of the fields. We are used to thinking about our ancestors in a highly romanticized light. Allegedly, Slavic tribes lived in perfect harmony with nature, danced in circles, and stood united against external foes. The reality of the 10th century was far more pragmatic and merciless. They were not brothers. They were fierce competitors. A Polan had more in common with his own battle axe than he did with a Lutetian. The tribes spoke in similar dialects, prayed to similar gods, Perun, Svarog, Veles. Yet they slaughtered one another with absolute ruthlessness. The center of tribal life was the Gord, a wooden and earth stronghold surrounded by a high palisade and a deep moat. Inside this Gord sat the local prince with his retinue. Grain reserves were stored there, and peasants from surrounding villages would flee behind its walls whenever smoke appeared on the horizon. And smoke appeared very frequently. The economy of this world was not built on agriculture alone. The land provided bread so you didn't starve to death. But to acquire silver, high-quality weapons, expensive fabrics, and prestige, you needed a much more serious commodity. The primary export resource of 10th century Central Europe was human beings. This is the harsh, unvarnished truth of the era. The pagan lands between the Oder and the Rus were a colossal hunting ground. The Christian monarchs of the West and the Islamic emirs of the East required slaves, a lot of slaves. In the markets of Prague, Magdeburg, and Regensburg, human merchandise was exchanged for Arab dirhams, Frankish swords, and Byzantine silk. So how does a tribal chieftain get rich? It's very simple. You gather your warriors, cross the river to your neighbors, burn their village to the ground, take the women, children, and strong men, and then sell them to foreign merchants. This system of mutual raiding severely depleted the Slavic lands. It made them the absolute perfect target. For the Holy Roman Empire, which at this time was methodically pushing its borders eastward, these fragmented Slavic tribes were not a military adversary. They were a resource. Saxon margraves looked at these lands as a buffer zone from which they could endlessly draw loot and free labor, all while hiding behind the holy mission of Christianization. The Germanic military machine was highly organized. They had heavy cavalry, siege technology, stone architecture, and an ironclad ideological foundation. The Slavs had only forests, wooden shields, and mutual hatred. The empire didn't even have to exert its full strength to conquer these territories. The margraves simply pitted the tribes against one another. They bribed certain chieftains to annihilate others. The system worked flawlessly. The forest world was devouring itself, clearing the road for German garrisons. To survive this meat grinder, the Slavs needed to make an impossible leap. They needed to break their own nature, to stop being dozens of warring clans and become a true state. A state with a single center, a monopoly on power, and an army capable of marching out onto an open field to face imperial cavalry head-on. Whoever attempted to do this would need an iron will and a total absence of sentimentality. At the beginning of the 10th century, the Poland tribe is ruled by the Pious dynasty. Through force and cunning, they have already begun slowly subjugating the neighboring minor Gords. But their grip on power is still incredibly fragile. It is exactly at this time that a son is born to the prince of the Polans, Siemomysl, an heir. But the joy in the princely hall is swiftly replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The boy opens his eyes, and everyone sees that they are motionless. Siemomysl's son was born blind. In a world where a ruler must personally lead his retinue into battle, where any sign of weakness immediately invites a rebellion or an invasion by neighbors, a blind heir is a death sentence. For the father, it is a profound disgrace. For the tribe, it is a clear sign of the god's curse. For 7 years, the boy lived in darkness, hidden from prying eyes behind the thick oak walls of the gourd. For 7 years, Siemomysl looked with deep anxiety at the growing sons of rival chieftains, realizing that his own lineage might end with this disabled child. But 10th century chroniclers absolutely love symbolism, and what happened on the boy's 7th birthday became the ultimate metaphor for everything he would later do to his country. The chronicler, Gallus Anonymous, whose text describes the history of Polish rulers from legendary times up to the early 12th century, recounts this episode as follows. The boy turns 7 years old. According to Slavic custom, it is time for the postrzyny, the ritual cutting of hair. This is a crucial transition. The child leaves the women's half of the household and is officially placed under the care of his father. Prince Siemomysl summons the tribal elders and neighbors to a grand feast. But the celebration is poisoned by anxiety. A blind heir is a massive vulnerability. In a world where the chieftain is obligated to personally lead the warband into battle and judge disputes, a crippled prince will not live long. The tribe simply will not follow him. And suddenly, right in the middle of the sacred rite, The boy opens his eyes. He sees the faces of the people around him. He sees the fire burning in the hearth. The blindness is gone. The chronicler describes this as a miracle and a divine sign from above. Historians can speculate all they want, ranging from temporary cataracts to a banal fabrication, invented decades later to bestow an aura of the chosen one upon the dynasty's founder. But if you look at this legend without the mysticism, it works as an incredibly precise metaphor. Mieszko's blindness represents the state of the Slavic tribes in the first half of the 10th century. They were living completely blind. They fought over strips of woodland, stole each other's cattle, and entirely failed to notice how, just to the west, a power was forming capable of wiping them all out. The boy's sudden gaining of sight is a political awakening. When Ciamomisl dies and Mieszko takes power, he acts like a man who has suddenly seen the entire map all at once. He understands. The old tribal system is doomed. A militia where farmers only grab their axes when the enemy is already standing at the gates of the gourd will never be able to stop heavy imperial cavalry. Mieszko begins to dismantle the customary way of life. He needs a permanent, standing army that answers only to him. Warriors who do not sow and do not plow. Men whose only job is war. He no longer wants to be merely the first among equals among the chieftains. He violently subjugates the lands around Poznan and Gniezno. Local petty princes who try to maintain their independence are either annihilated or exiled. The piousts build a completely new system, a rigid vertical power structure where the population is legally obligated to hand over a portion of their harvest to maintain the prince's retinue. Essentially, Mieszko transforms the tribal alliance into one massive military camp. But here, a major problem arises. Professional cavalry is extraordinarily expensive. A top-tier sword, a chainmail hauberk, a helmet, a purebred warhorse. These are massive expenditures. Peasant grain and honey were barely enough to feed the men, but to arm them with the finest Frankish or Scandinavian weaponry required silver. Mieszko desperately needed money, a stable, inexhaustible river of silver to pay his retinue. Otherwise, his own warriors would simply slit his throat. Where do you find such funds in the deep woods, far removed from the ancient trade routes of Rome and Byzantium? This pressing question led Mieszko to the most ruthless economic decision of his entire life. We know exactly what kind of machine he built and how it generated revenue thanks to a completely random witness. A man who arrived in these harsh lands from a world of fine silk, complex mathematics, and exotic spices. Picture a man from 10th century Córdoba. He is accustomed to stone palaces, paved streets, grand libraries, and algebra. This man is a Jewish merchant, physician, and diplomat from Muslim Spain named Ibrahim ibn Yaqub. In 965 or 966, he embarks on a long journey to the barbaric north of Europe. He travels through the Germanic lands, reaches Prague, and leaves us the very first written snapshot of the young pious state. Ibrahim is a man of business. He has no interest in myths, forest spirits, or fairy tales about magically cured blind boys. He is writing an intelligence report, And in this dry, factual text, the undisguised astonishment of a professional shines through. Ibn Yaqub calls Mieszko the king of the north. He dryly notes that the realm of the piasts is the most extensive of all the Slavic lands. But the main thing that causes the Arab diplomat to pause his quill over the parchment is the army. 3,000 heavily armed warriors clad in chainmail. Ibrahim notes, 100 of such men mean as much as 10 hundreds of others. 3,000 armored cavalrymen in the forests of Europe is a force that literally shifts the geopolitical gravity of the entire region. But the raw number isn't what's most interesting. What's fascinating is exactly how Mieszko manages them. The prince doesn't just muster a militia for the summer campaign season, only to send the men home afterward. He maintains a professional standing army all year round. Ibrahim describes a social system that was absolutely mind-boggling for its time. Mieszko pays his retainers a monthly salary. If a warrior has a child, the prince assigns the infant a stipend from his own treasury from their very first day of life. If a warrior decides to get married, Mieszko personally pays the bride price to the father of the bride. This specific detail explains everything. Mieszko isn't just hiring men. He is outright purchasing 100% biological loyalty. These 3,000 men no longer belong to their tribal elders, their clans, or their gods. They belong exclusively to the prince. Their social status, their full bellies, and the future of their children depend directly on how secure Mieszko's grip on power is. If the prince falls, they lose absolutely everything. But to feed and equip a corporate entity of this size, you need silver. Vast amounts of silver. There are no active silver mines in the Polish lands at this time. So, where is the money coming from? The answer is buried at the bottom of hundreds of hoards that archaeologists are still digging up across Poland today. Clay pots stuffed to the brim with chopped up Arab dirhams. Mieszko built a brutally efficient export economy. Furs, wax, and honey flowed south and west. But the primary, most liquid asset was human beings. For Mieszko's retinue, war was not an act of revenge or a noble quest for glory. It was a highly calibrated business process. The prince's troops conducted regular, systematic raids on neighboring, independent Slavic tribes, the Lutici to the northwest, or the Vistulans to the south. Captured prisoners were marched on foot to the markets of Prague or to the imperial borders, where they were sold wholesale to merchants like Ibrahim ibn Yaqub. A healthy man or woman was exchanged for a handful of heavyweight silver. That silver went toward purchasing the finest Frankish swords and paying the salaries of the retinue. The retinue got better swords, grew in numbers, and marched out to capture even more prisoners. It was a perfect, closed-loop, utterly merciless cycle of state building. Inside his own forests, Mieszko became the absolute master. He built a thriving economy, crushed regional separatism, and heavily armed his elite. In the eyes of his own subjects, he was utterly untouchable. But all you had to do was widen the political map just a fraction, and this omnipotence instantly turned into a mirage. 3,000 professional fighters is an ironclad argument in a dispute with a neighboring tribe. But just across the Oder River stood the Holy Roman Empire, capable of fielding not 3, but tens of thousands of armored knights. And to them, Mieszko's brilliantly organized, wealthy state was not an equal partner. It was a pagan aberration, a massive, incredibly fat piece of loot that could and should be taken in the name of the Christian cross and the imperial crown. And soon enough, a dark shadow appeared on the western borders of the piasts. A man who had absolutely no intention of haggling for silver, because he was entirely accustomed to taking everything with iron. Remember the Saxon Margrave Giro, the man who barred the doors at a feast and in cold blood slaughtered 30 Slavic chieftains? By the early 960s, he is no longer just a brazen military commander. Giro is the governor of the Eastern March of the Holy Roman Empire. A march is not just a regular administrative province. It is a highly militarized buffer zone, a staging ground for a constant, methodical advance to the east. The empire did not operate like a wild horde that sweeps in, plunders, and vanishes. It moved like a heavy clockwork mechanism. Conquer the territory, build a stone fortress, forcibly baptize the survivors, impose crushing taxes, then take a step toward the next river, and repeat the cycle. To Giro, the Slavic tribes were simply a resource, land that needed to be developed, and a workforce that needed to be subjugated. If anyone resisted, they were ground into dust. The ideology of the empire gave them absolute moral justification for this. They weren't merely conquering territories. They were bringing the holy light of Christianity to savages, which meant any and all methods were fully justified. By 963, this imperial machine rolled right up to the Oder River, directly onto the borders of Mieszko's young state. Up until this moment, Mieszko was used to being the biggest, strongest player in his forest sandbox. His tribe dominated. His retinue of 3,000 professionals easily shattered the resistance of their neighbors. He had vast amounts of silver, total power, and absolute confidence in his own strength. But when his army collided head-on with the German military machine for the first time, everything changed. The chronicles of those years are extremely sparse on details. They record only the most important fact. In 963, Mieszko engages in direct conflict with Germanic forces and suffers a catastrophic defeat. His elite armored retinue, so used to chasing disorganized tribes, crumbles under the crushing impact of imperial troops. In this brutal slaughter, Mieszko's brother is killed. We don't even know his name. The chroniclers did not see fit to waste precious ink on the name of a dead pagan. To the empire, the death of a Slavic princeling was just standard statistics for a border raid. But for Mieszko, it was a rude awakening, a bucket of ice water to the face. He lost his brother. He lost a significant portion of his retinue, and he finally understood the ultimate geopolitical truth of his era. In a direct clash with the empire, he had absolutely zero chance. Even if he gathered all the silver in the north and hired twice as many warriors, the empire would just send fresh legions. It wasn't merely about the sheer number of soldiers. It was about the rules of the game. As long as Mieszko remained a pagan, any German margrave could declare a holy war against him at any given moment. Mieszko had zero legitimate status in the eyes of Europe. You didn't need to negotiate with him. You didn't need to sign non-aggression pacts with him. You could only plunder him, impose heavy tribute upon him, and slowly, year after year, squeeze him entirely off his own land. Mieszko realizes, to survive, he will have to take an unprecedented step. He must strip the empire of its ultimate trump card, its ideological justification for war. But decisions of that magnitude take time. You need to prepare the ground, find powerful allies in the south, and negotiate with your own high priests. And time was the one thing he did not have. The empire was masterful at fighting proxy wars. Giro and the Germanic lords saw that Mieszko was licking his wounds after the crushing defeat, and instead of sending their own soldiers to finish off the weakened prince, they utilized the perfect instrument of destabilization. They unleashed Mieszko's own neighbors against him, the Lutici, those same ferocious pagans from the northwest. But for wild tribal fury to strike its target with precision, it needs a good commander. And soon enough, a man appears on the borders of the Polans with a cross around his neck and pure hatred in his heart. A German exile whom the empire had spat out, but whom the Slavic tribes had embraced as their very own warlord. Wichman the Younger appears on the northern borders of the Polans. Wichman is a deeply paradoxical figure, a high-ranking Saxon aristocrat, a relative of Emperor Otto himself, but at the same time an outcast, a rebel who fell out violently with his own family, fled the empire, and found refuge in a place where it was utterly unthinkable for a Christian to be, among the pagan Lutici. The Lutici are not just another Slavic tribe. They are a fierce confederacy, united by fanatical devotion to their ancient pagan gods. Their spiritual and political center was located in Radogosta, massive wooden temple city, where the idol of the war god Swarojic stood. The chronicles describe this temple as a terrifying and majestic place, adorned with the horns of wild animals and bloody war trophies. The priests of Radogost possessed colossal power. They divined the future using a sacred horse. If the beast stepped over crossed spears with the correct hoof, the tribes rode out to war. To them, Mieszko, who was aggressively building a centralized state and crushing the ancient ancestral freedoms of his neighbors, was just as much of a threat as the Germans. And so, a Saxon knight with a cross around his neck stands at the head of a pagan horde, riding into battle beneath the banners of Swarojic. Wichman gave the Lutici the one thing they lacked: advanced European battlefield tactics. In 963, and then again shortly after, he inflicts two devastating defeats upon Mieszko's forces. We do not know the exact tactical details of these battles, but the chronicles dryly record the ultimate result. The Polan army is smashed, the borders are breached, and the elite retinue suffers critical losses. Mieszko is thrown far back into the depths of his own forests. The prince's position became utterly hopeless. To the west stands Gero's heavy cavalry. To the north, the army of the Lutici under the command of a Saxon general, an army that has already proven its superiority twice over. To the south lies powerful Bohemia, which couldn't care less about the problems of the Polans. The tribal militia is exhausted. The silver is bleeding out to patch holes in the defense, and the pagan gods have clearly turned their backs on Mieszko. He understands with crystal clarity he simply will not survive a third strike by Vikman or a direct invasion by the Empire. The state he had stitched together with so much blood from forest tribes would vanish in a single summer. To survive, he had to break the rules entirely. If the Empire uses his unbaptized status as an excuse for aggression, and the Lutici are massacring his people for the glory of their ancient gods, then he needs to strike at both threats, using a highly unconventional weapon. Mieszko looks to the south, toward Prague. In Prague sat Boleslaus the Cruel, a man who, in his time, cold-bloodedly murdered his own brother Wenceslaus for the sake of the throne. Brutal, highly pragmatic, but a recognized, legitimate Christian monarch whose cavalry was one of the finest in the entire region. Mieszko sends ambassadors proposing a military alliance. Boleslaus' response was entirely logical. Christian sovereigns do not sign official pacts with pagan forest dwellers. The price for military aid was the total renunciation of the old gods. But Mieszko couldn't just stand up and announce his baptism. Neither his neighbors nor his own people would have understood it. He needed to bind Bohemia and his lands by blood, to secure physical, tangible guarantees of protection. He asks for the hand of Boleslaus' daughter in marriage, and the Bohemian prince sends him the woman who will forever alter the face of the country. The year is 965. A grand procession rides through the wooden gates of Poznan, looking completely alien against the backdrop of the harsh Slavic gourd. This is the Bohemian princess Dubravka, or Dobrava, the daughter of Boleslaus the Cruel, the ruler of Bohemia, a mighty and merciless monarch. Along with her, into the pagan heartland of the Polans arrive Latin priests, heavy crosses, the pungent smell of incense, and an entirely new set of rules for the game. Boleslaus the Cruel had set a brutal price. No official alliances with pagans. Mieszko must adopt Christianity and banish all 7 of his pagan wives. For a forest chieftain, dismissing his wives is not a matter of morality or lust. It is an incredibly dangerous political crisis. Pagan wives are the daughters of local elders, living guarantees of the loyalty of subjugated clans. To send them away meant inflicting a massive public insult upon his own elite. Mieszko risked sparking a massive internal rebellion long before Bohemian cavalry ever arrived to help him. And right here, we come to one of the most revealing historical anecdotes of that entire era. Usually, Dobrava is depicted as a meek, holy virgin, a woman who, with endless Christian patience, endured the roughness of her savage husband and, through gentle persuasion, led him into the light of truth. But the German chronicler Thietmar of Merseburg records a specific detail that completely destroys this sugary myth. Dobrava arrives in Poland during the period of Great Lent. For a deeply devout Christian of the 10th century, breaking the Lenten fast is an incredibly grave sin. But the princess sits down at the feasting table with Mieszko and his pagan retinue. Meat is placed in front of her, and she eats it, right in front of the stunned, horrified eyes of her own priests. Thietmar explains this highly pragmatically. She intentionally violated the strictest religious prohibition solely to please her husband. to ensure she didn't alienate him with Christian arrogance, to become one of his own, and to worm her way into his trust. Mieszko had allegedly thrown down a challenge. He said he would only be baptized if she shared his meal, and she immediately agreed. This is not the behavior of a fragile, pious martyr. This is the behavior of a cold-blooded politician. Dobrawa is the daughter of a murderer. She understood perfectly well what kind of world she had ridden into, and exactly what was truly at stake. It's one thing to demand baptism in a parchment treaty written somewhere far away in Prague. It is quite another to force a fiercely proud, highly suspicious warlord to actually bow his head before a foreign god in front of his heavily armed retinue. If forging a geopolitical alliance requires eating a chunk of roasted venison during Lents, she is going to eat it. And this ruthless pragmatism worked perfectly. Mieszko and Dobrawa were made for each other. They both viewed the world with supreme, sobering clarity. For her, this marriage was a strategic way to tether the buffer lands of the north to Bohemia. For him, it was the only chance to buy his state a seat in the legitimate European club and gain access to his father-in-law's heavy cavalry. By the spring of 966, all the political pieces were set on the board. Mieszko's 7 pagan wives have been sent back to their homes. Their clans, grinding their teeth, swallowed the bitter insult. The Bohemian princess Dobrawa has arrived in Poznan, brought the cross with her, and proven to her husband that she is not there to lecture him on morality, but to build a powerful alliance. The treaty with Prague has been signed. Only one final formality remained, the very one for which all of this had been orchestrated. Mieszko had to wash away his and his people's status as legitimate prey. He had to be baptized. Where exactly this took place, we still don't know to this day. Some historians are absolutely certain the ceremony took place in Regensburg, deep in the heart of Bavaria, to heavily emphasize the significance of the event before all of Europe. Others argue that it happened in Poznan or Gniezno, inside a hastily erected wooden chapel, where Mieszko brought his entire 3,000-strong elite retinue. There is even a theory that he took the cross on Bohemian soil, in Prague, sealing his alliance with Boleslas the Cruel. The chronicles are hopelessly tangled, the dates are blurred, and there is a deep paradox in this. The single event that determined the fate of an entire nation for a millennium to come was left without precise coordinates. But if we strip away the endless debates about the location and look at the core essence, on April 14th, 966, most likely on Holy Saturday, something absolutely unprecedented for Forest Europe occurred. Picture this scene. The pagan warlord of the Polans, a man whose name until very recently was associated purely with violent raids and the slave trade, steps into a baptismal font. Alongside him are his greatest warriors. Standing nearby are the Latin priests who arrived with Dobrawa. This was no grand spiritual epiphany. There was no tearful repentance of sins or a sudden flash of divine faith. Mieszko stepped into that water as a politician, signing the most critical contract of his entire life. The act of baptism was not the descent of Holy Grace. It was a strict legal procedure. The water was not washing away original sin. The water was washing away the empire's legal right to launch a crusade against the Polans. From the exact moment the bishop uttered the necessary words in Latin, Mieszko I ceased to be a chieftain of savages. He became a Christian monarch, an equal, a brother in Christ to any European ruler, from Emperor Otto to the Pope in Rome. Now, if the Saxon Margrave Odo or any other imperial governor decides to attack Mieszko's lands, it will no longer be a pious, holy mission to convert pagans. It will be an unprovoked attack on a sovereign Christian state. And for pulling something like that in 10th century Europe, you could be hit with excommunication and crushing diplomatic isolation. Mieszko utilized the West's ultimate ideological weapon, religion, to forge an impenetrable legal shield around his borders. But this brilliant foreign policy maneuver had a severe dark side. In Europe, Mieszko was now a legitimate ruler. But at home, in the dense forests between the Oder and the Vistula, to the vast majority of his subjects, he had just become a traitor. The water in the baptismal font dried. The festive garments were packed away in chests. For Mieszko, the high diplomacy ended and brutal reality began. Adopting a new faith in a closed circle of trusted confidants is a political gesture, but forcing an entire people to forget the gods they have lived with for centuries, that is a task of an entirely different magnitude. Along with Mieszko, Jordan arrived in the Polish lands, the very first bishop. He required guarantees, social status, and a flock. And Mieszko issued an order that made this exact point in history irreversible. He ordered the cutting down of the sacred groves and the burning of the idols. This is the moment where we must pause. Mieszko's action is tantamount to political suicide for a forest chieftain. Imagine how this actually looked in practice. The prince's heavily armed detachments marched into settlements. The massive wooden statues of Perun, Svarog, and Veles, before which people had sworn sacred oaths and slaughtered sacrificial cattle just yesterday, were hacked to the ground with axes. They were chopped into firewood or thrown violently into the rivers. Rough wooden crosses were hastily erected on the sites of ancient pagan sanctuaries. A modern person looks at this and sees historical progress. But now look at it through the eyes of an average Slavic peasant in the 10th century. To him, Mieszko has completely betrayed his own bloodline. The prince has brought outsiders into their forests, dressed in long black robes, speaking an incomprehensible language. These outsiders are burning the trees where the spirits of the ancestors live. The pagan priests, the very people who for countless generations had healed diseases, preserved the sacred traditions, and predicted the harvests, were suddenly declared outlaws. They were forced to flee deep into the woods, hiding in remote swamps, becoming the natural center of fierce resistance. And most importantly, the new faith proved to be incredibly expensive. The machinery of the church demanded resources. Mieszko introduces massive new levies. A peasant who was already surrendering the lion's share of his harvest and livestock to maintain the prince's heavy cavalry, now had to pay the church on top of that, to give the fruits of his grueling labor to a foreign god who did not promise rain and did not protect the flocks from wolves. A deep sullen discontent engulfed the lands of the Polans. People outright refused to be baptized. Whispers spread through the forests that the old gods would take bloody revenge. They would send the plague, drive away the game, and strip the prince of his luck in battle. This is exactly where the fate of many rulers breaks permanently. A mob, whipped into a frenzy by priests and embittered tribal elders, could have easily torn Mieszko to pieces, and the prince understood this perfectly. He could not afford a single ounce of mercy or weakness. Christianization walked strictly hand in hand with direct, unvarnished terror. Those who openly opposed the new order or sheltered the pagan priests were violently subdued. Pagan uprisings were mercilessly crushed by the armored retinue, those same 3,000 warriors who served the prince personally for a generous salary. Yesterday, they prayed to Perun. Today, they were hacking off the heads of those defending Perun's altars. Because their absolute loyalty was bought with Mieszko's silver, not by the wrath of the old gods. This is the terrifying paradox of the ruler. Mieszko had to spill the blood of his own people, brutally break their traditions, and violently shake taxes out of them. He didn't do this out of religious fanaticism. He did it so that tomorrow, those exact same people wouldn't be wiped off the face of the earth by the German march. A state is not a peaceful union of free tribes. It is a heavy, grinding mechanism that demands total submission. Mieszko sacrificed the traditional world on the altar of national security. He crossed the line beyond which there was no going back to the wild forest freedom. The prince of the Polans held on to power with an iron grip. The fires of the pagan sanctuaries went out, replaced by the heavy smoke from the forges where new weapons were being hammered. But the brewing unrest among the tribes did not go unnoticed. Neighbors clearly saw that Mieszko's country was undergoing a severe internal breakdown. His enemies decided, the prince is highly vulnerable. His army is tied down pacifying his own villages. His people absolutely hate him, and his old gods have abandoned him forever. The year 967 arrived, and in the north the banners of the Lutici appeared once again, and leading them was the very same man with whom Mieszko still had an unpaid blood debt. The year is 967. Wichman the Younger returns. The Saxon exile who has already smashed Mieszko twice and killed his brother is once again leading an army against the Polans. This time, it is the Volhynian tribe. Wichman is completely confident in victory. He knows exactly how the Polans fight. He knows their glaring weaknesses, and he knows their fear of his superior tactics. But on the battlefield, a massive surprise awaits the Saxon. Instead of the usual foot militia and highly vulnerable flanks, armored riders ride out to meet him. This is heavy Bohemian cavalry sent by Mieszko's father-in-law, Boleslaus the Cruel. The treaty, sealed by baptism and Dobravus, intentionally broken fast, had worked flawlessly. The battle instantly turns into a slaughter. The Volhynian army is completely crushed. Wichman himself, covered in wounds and backed into a corner, is forced to surrender. The German chronicler Widukind of Corvey, a contemporary to these events, writes that before his death, the Saxon handed his sword to Mieszko's warriors with one final request: to send it to Emperor Otto. Shortly after, Wichmann dies of his wounds. And right here comes the precise moment that displays Mieszko's true magnitude as a politician. What should a typical 10th century forest chieftain have done with the corpse of his most hated enemy? The man who spent years burning his villages and who took the life of his own blood brother. The logic of the tribal world, the logic of blood vengeance, demanded impaling the Saxon's head on a spear and mounting it over the gates of Poznan, mutilating the body to project power and terror to the neighbors. But Mieszko is no longer a tribal chieftain. He is a recognized Christian monarch, and he thinks entirely in the categories of high European diplomacy. He takes Wichmann's sword, he takes his personal belongings, and he sends all of it directly to the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Otto the Great, along with a highly respectful message, the essence of which comes down to this: your rebellious subject, who caused you so much trouble, is dead. I, your loyal friend, have taken care of it. The head of an enemy on a pike, that is the triumph of a savage. The sword of an enemy handed with a deep bow to a suzerain, that is the triumph of a statesman. With this single gesture, Mieszko demonstrated a colossal paradox to all of Europe. He, the Slavic pagan of just yesterday, proved to be a vastly better knight than a high-born Saxon aristocrat who had betrayed his homeland. He proved that he was a highly reliable partner, fully capable of solving the empire's problems on its volatile eastern borders. The diplomatic isolation of the Polans was shattered completely. Emperor Otto accepts this grand gesture quite favorably. Mieszko even receives the informal, yet incredibly prestigious status of friend of the emperor. It seems the ultimate goal has been achieved. The ideological shield has been forged. His legitimacy is universally recognized, and the state is safe. But that's only what they thought in distant Magdeburg and in the sunny villas of Italy, where the emperor spent most of his time. On the far eastern border of the empire, the mood was entirely different. To the German Margraves, whose garrisons stood squarely on the Oder, Mieszko's diplomatic triumph was a painful thorn in their side. They saw what the distant emperor completely missed. This Slavic prince was learning way too fast. He adopted their faith, acquired heavy cavalry, and had just utterly annihilated their former allies. If he wasn't stopped right now, while his state was still forming, tomorrow he would come for their lands. And one of these men decides to take matters into his own hands. His name was Odo, or Hodo. He was tasked with guarding the border of the empire, but he viewed himself not as a watchman, but as a conqueror. To wildly ambitious men like him, the Slavs remained entirely barbarians, regardless of whether they were baptized or not. In the eyes of the border lords, Mieszko's treaty with the emperor was a frustrating diplomatic error that needed to be corrected immediately, preferably by brute force. Mieszko, meanwhile, continued to aggressively expand his influence. After his victory over Wichmann, he began methodically subjugating the tribes of Pomerania, a wealthy region in the north with direct access to the Baltic Sea. This gave him total control over lucrative trade routes and even more silver. For Odo, this was the absolute last straw. The rapidly growing economic and military power of the Polish prince directly threatened the core interests of the Saxon nobility in this region. and the Margrave begins to assemble an army. Here we encounter a crucial political nuance of the 10th century. Odo operated entirely without the permission of Emperor Otto. Moreover, most likely, directly against his will. But in the political coordinate system of the time, a border Margrave possessed enough autonomy to launch a localized war under the convenient pretext of defending the interests of the empire. Odo was relying on a very simple rule. Victors are not judged. If he crushes Mieszko, seizes Pomerania, and brings the emperor vast new lands and tribute, Otto would gladly turn a blind eye to his insubordination. In 972, a massive, heavily armed German army marches out to war. Odo was supremely confident in a swift, easy success. He clearly remembered how, just a few years ago, Margrave Gero had playfully shattered the Slavic militias. He knew that Mieszko's Bohemian allies were currently tied up with their own affairs and would not ride to the rescue. He was leading elite knightly cavalry, battle-hardened and lethal, against men who were forest dwellers just yesterday. The Margrave expected a remarkably easy stroll. He failed to account for just one thing: exactly how much Mieszko had changed since their last encounter. News of the invasion reached Poznan incredibly fast. Mieszko did not hide behind the earthen ramparts of his gorge. He understood perfectly well. If he lets German cavalry loose on the plains of the Polans, they will burn everything he had built over the last 10 years. The prince makes the decision to meet the enemy directly at the border, at the Oder River. Riding alongside Mieszko on this campaign is a man whose name we hear in the chronicles for the very first time, specifically in connection with these events: his brother, Tibor. And the way the two of them prepare to greet the imperial war machine will become an absolute masterclass in military tactics. The news of the enemy offensive reached Poznan in record time. Mieszko had a choice: sit tight behind the earthen walls of his fortresses and force the Germans to waste their men and precious time on grueling sieges, a classic defensive strategy. But allowing the enemy deep into the country meant giving up for plunder the very same lands from which the prince extracted the heavy taxes to maintain his army. For the tribal nobility, who had only just barely submitted to his iron rule, it would be a glaring signal: Mieszko is weak, he cannot protect us. Therefore, the prince marches out to meet them, to the Oder River, which marked the border. Riding next to him is a man whose name appears in the chronicles for the first time precisely in connection with these events: Cedynia, Mieszko's blood brother. In the context of the era, their relationship looks almost like a complete anomaly. In the 10th century, and indeed in the centuries that followed, brothers in ruling dynasties were natural-born enemies. Boleslaus the Cruel in Bohemia slaughtered his brother Wenceslaus for the throne. The descendants of Mieszko himself would later turn fratricide, blinding, and the exile of relatives into daily political routine. Power absolutely does not tolerate competitors. But here, in 972, we witness unquestioning unity. Mieszko does not fear that Cedynia will strike him in the back. He trusts his brother with his own life and the ultimate fate of the entire principality. Right before the impending battle, he hands Cedynia command of the reserve, that very same elite ironclad retinue. The Poland's army approaches the fortress of Cedynia, or Cedyni, as the Germans called it. Mieszko and Cedynia survey the terrain.
and the way they prepare for the clash with the imperial Margrave proves beyond a doubt that these men have long outgrown the primitive tactics of forest ambushes.
They are thinking in the highest categories of full-scale warfare. Giving a pitched battle to heavy German cavalry on an open plain is sheer suicide. The devastating impact of Saxon lances at full gallop would simply sweep the Slavic infantry away. Therefore, the brothers select the absolute perfect location for a death trap. A narrow bottleneck not far from the crossing over the Oder. On one side lies the river and deep, sucking swamps where war horses cannot tread. On the other, steep, heavily forested hills. If the German vanguard is drawn into this corridor, it will instantly lose its greatest advantage, the space to build up speed and maneuver. In tight quarters, a knight loses the force of his charge and becomes nothing more than a slow-moving target encased in heavy armor. 6 years ago, the baptismal water bought Mieszko's state the one thing silver could never purchase: time. Time to fortify the borders, drill the army, and subjugate Pomerania. The new religion operated flawlessly as a diplomatic shield, halting the official expansion of the empire. But every shield is eventually tested for strength. The time for diplomacy had officially run out. Now, iron would do the talking. The Polans' plan was diabolically risky. To lure Odo into the narrow gorge, someone had to act as the bait. Someone had to take the first terrifying impact of the German cavalry, bleed, panic, and run, dragging the enemy behind them into the trap. If this detachment ran too quickly, the Germans would immediately sense a trick. If they ran too slowly, they would simply be butchered on the spot. Mieszko takes this suicidal role of the vanguard commander entirely upon himself. Cedynia and the heavy cavalry vanish into the woods on the hills to wait. The night before a battle always sounds exactly the same, no matter what language the soldiers speak. The grinding of whetstones, the snorting of horses, the quiet, tense conversations around the campfires. Margrave Odo slept with the absolute certainty of a man who would crush the barbarians by noon tomorrow and annex vast new lands to his domain. Mieszko did not sleep at all, knowing that tomorrow morning he would have to stare directly into the eyes of charging death and pretend to be a coward. The sky above the Oder begins to lighten. June 24th, 972, arrives. Early morning. The sun is just starting to bake, but a damp chill still rolls off the river. The German army pulls up to the crossing. Margrave Odo is supremely confident, and he has every reason to, because army looks absolutely terrifying. Dense ranks of heavily armed Saxon knights, professional infantry, deeply experienced commanders. This is the absolute elite, the very men accustomed to dictating the will of the empire on its eastern frontiers. They begin crossing the Oder, slowly, methodically, like a heavy steamroller. Mieszko gives them absolutely no time to form up into perfect battle formations. The second Odo's vanguard steps onto the eastern bank. The Polans strike first. The Slavic attack is ferocious, but, from the perspective of the German commanders, predictably disorganized. Slavic infantry and light cavalry violently clash with the ironclad Saxons. Steel rings out, wooden shields shatter. The first casualties fall, the first blood is drawn. Mieszko is right in the very center of this brutal melee, and right here he must demonstrate unimaginable iron restraint. He must withstand the initial onslaught, let the Germans taste blood and easy victory, but not let his own men be utterly annihilated in the meat grinder. And most importantly, he must make Odo firmly believe that the Poland army has broken. At a certain point, when the crushing pressure of the Saxon lances becomes unbearable, the Slavic lines begin to fall back. At first, slowly, step by step. Then the formation shatters. What looked like an organized retreat instantly morphs into a panicked rout right before the Germans' eyes. The Polans abandon their dead and wounded, turn around, and flee toward the saving grace of the hills, running straight into the narrow corridor between the river and the slope. Odo sees exactly what he expected to see. The savages have broken. Their highly praised prince is running for his life. To the Margrave, this is the ultimate moment of triumph. Victory is already squarely in his grasp. He only needs to finish off the fleeing enemy before they scatter entirely into the woods. There is no time to think. If he stops now, Mieszko will escape, gather fresh forces, and the war will have to be fought all over again. Odo issues the fatal order: pursue. The heavy German cavalry instantly surges forward. The knights spur their horses, hurtling after the fleeing Slavs. They fly directly into the tight, narrow space between the river and the densely forested hills. And this is exactly where physics and geography begin working violently against the empire. The road sharply narrows. The Saxon battle formation, perfectly aligned for a devastating strike on an open field, rapidly begins to deform. Riders clash into one another. The horses bunch up into a dense, incredibly slow-moving mass. There is absolutely no space left to maneuver. The terrifying knightly cavalry bleeds all its speed and turns into a helplessly trapped crowd stuck inside a bottleneck. Mieszko, running near the front, suddenly halts his men. The panic vanishes just as rapidly as it began. The retreating Slavs sharply pivot, lock their shields, and completely seal off the path forward for the Germans. Odo doesn't even comprehend what has just happened yet. His vanguard is bogged down, but his own troops from the rear keep pushing forward, crushing into the backs of their comrades. The Margrave is hopelessly stuck in a trap that he himself slammed shut with his blind thirst for a quick victory. And at that exact moment, the hills above them come alive. The Saxon knights, tightly jammed in the narrow corridor, raise their heads. Down from the dense thickets, where no eye had pierced before and not a single sound had escaped, men begin to emerge. Hundreds of men in heavy chainmail, wielding swords, battle axes, and spears. It was the reserve, the absolute elite of the Polans. And leading them was Czezibor. The reserve crashed down from the wooded hills directly into the exposed flank of the stretched-out German column. The Saxon knights didn't stand a chance. The heavy armor and long lances that made them the undisputed kings of the open field became a deadly curse in the cramped gorge. Horses slipped and bogged down in the mud. The riders could neither turn around for a counterattack nor retreat. The rear ranks of their own army, unable to see the carnage ahead, continued to press forward into their backs, completely corking the only exit. This was no longer a battle. It was a butchery and physical extermination. Czebor's warriors ripped the heavily armed Germans down from their horses. In the crushing tightness, the outcome was decided not by refined knightly training, but by short swords, axes, and brute strength. Those Saxons who attempted to save themselves by diving into the river sank straight to the bottom under the massive weight of their own chainmail. Margrave Odo's casualties were catastrophic. Chronicles describe the near-total annihilation of the entire German force. The Margrave himself, alongside a tiny handful of survivors, miraculously tore his way out of the meat grinder and fled, leaving both his army and his reputation dead on the banks of the Oder. On June 24th, 972, Mieszko's state proved its absolute right to exist. But it's not just the mere fact of the victory that matters. Look at exactly how it was achieved. Mieszko didn't crush an imperial Margrave just because he hid some guys in the bushes. He won a vastly complex tactical chess match. A feigned retreat is a highly sophisticated maneuver that demands ironclad discipline. If Mieszko's vanguard had consisted of a traditional tribal militia, the pretend flight would have inevitably devolved into genuine, uncontrollable panic. The men would have simply scattered to the winds. But the prince possessed a highly professional army, men who held their formation under the crushing impact of the finest cavalry in Europe and instantly pivoted the exact second the order was given. The forest chieftain of yesterday had outplayed the Western military school on its very own field. Now, Mieszko held all the cards, thousands of dead Saxons and a fleeing Margrave. Any tribal leader riding the high of such a triumph would have surged forward to burn German border fortresses, exact bloody revenge, and seize massive loot. But Mieszko halts his troops. He does not cross the Oder. He understands perfectly well. He has defeated Odo, not the empire itself. And he knows that the news of the complete destruction of a German army is already flying south to Italy, to where the emperor is currently residing. Otto the Great was absolutely furious. His grand design for the peaceful integration of the eastern frontiers had completely collapsed. One of his Margraves had unauthorizedly sparked a war and shamefully lost it. The emperor dispatches a rigid, uncompromising order to the Oder. Immediately cease any and all hostilities. Both rulers, Odo and Mieszko, are commanded to appear before the imperial court. In the spring of 973, they must present themselves in Quedlinburg, where Otto will personally decide their ultimate fate. Mieszko won the battle, but to preserve his state, he will have to pay for this victory with the most precious thing he possesses. Spring 973. The city of Quedlinburg. Here, to the grand residence of Emperor Otto the Great, envoys flock from all over Europe. Ambassadors arrive from Rome, Byzantium, Kievan Rus, Denmark, and Hungary. This is the absolute apex of the Holy Roman Empire's power, the political center of the continent, where borders are redrawn with a single spoken word. Into this dense crowd of dukes, counts, and bishops ride the two men whom Otto summoned personally, Margrave Odo, who lost the Battle of Cedynia, and Mieszko, who won it. They stand before the emperor, and here we see exactly how imperial justice functioned in reality. Odo blatantly violated a direct order. Because of his blind ambition, the empire lost an entire knightly army. By any military logic, he should have been instantly stripped of his title, his lands, and quite possibly his head. But Odo is flesh and blood of the Saxon aristocracy. He is tied by bloodlines to half the people standing in that very hall. Otto cannot simply execute a high-ranking German lord for the sake of a Slavic prince, even a baptized one. On the other side stands Mieszko. Formally, he is entirely in the right. He was defending his own sovereign lands. But he demonstrated terrifying power. His armored infantry just utterly annihilated an elite imperial vanguard. To Otto, this is a glaring red alarm. A ruler this independent and powerful on the eastern border simply did not fit into the empire's grand plans. Otto hands down a verdict that seems grossly unfair, but strikes with surgical precision at the core of state security. Odo receives nothing but a stern reprimand, no confiscations whatsoever. He retains his position as Margrave, but Mieszko, the actual victor of the war, is handed the bill. The emperor formally acknowledges that the Polans were defending themselves legally. But to absolutely guarantee that Mieszko will not march his brilliant army any further west, Otto demands a heavy pledge of peace. This pledge is to be Mieszko's own son, Boleslav, the very same boy who years later will earn the moniker the Brave and become the first crowned king of Poland. But for now, he is about 6 years old, and he must remain at the German court. Today, the word hostage paints a vivid mental picture of a dark dungeon and iron shackles. In the 10th century, it worked very differently. The child lived at the emperor's court, learned Latin, observed high European diplomacy from the inside out, and forged vital connections among the future elite. Essentially, it was the finest political academy of its time. But the core reality remained brutally harsh. If Mieszko violated the treaty, the boy's life would end. We do not know what Mieszko felt, leaving his firstborn among his recent bitter enemies. But he thought entirely like a grand strategist. The Battle of Cedynia proved the absolute viability of his state, and a temporary separation from his son purchased peace with the most powerful empire in the West. Mieszko bought himself time. He departs for Poznan, knowing that the border on the Oder is set in stone and his country is fundamentally safe. But he wouldn't even have to wait long. Just a few weeks after the summit in Quedlinburg, on May 7, 973, the aging Emperor Otto the Great suddenly dies. The death of a ruler of that magnitude in the early Middle Ages meant only one thing. The rules of the game had just been completely voided. The iron grip that held the empire in perfect equilibrium vanished overnight. Otto's heir is immediately challenged by the German dukes. A brutal struggle for the throne begins, filled with dark intrigue and armed rebellions. The Western Margraves instantly forget about the eastern border. Their own house is suddenly on fire. Mieszko observes this total chaos from Poznan. The imperial threat has been temporarily neutralized. He possesses a highly battle-hardened army, mountains of silver, and absolute security on his western flank. The prince understands a better opportunity might not present itself for decades. He turns his regiments around and strikes precisely where a blow was least expected, to the south. straight into the lands of the very people who had so recently sent him Dobrawa and the cavalry to win at Cedynia. The year is 977. Dobrawa dies. The woman who brought the cross, the Bohemian cavalry, and the VIP passed to European politics, to the lands of the Polans, passes away, and right along with her vanishes the single reason Mieszko maintained peace with Prague. There is absolutely no room for sentimentality in 10th century politics. As long as his wife was alive, Bohemia remained a highly valuable ally. The very second she was gone, it immediately morphed into a prime competitor. Furthermore, following Otto's death, a bloody struggle for the throne erupted in the empire, and the former allies suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the barricades. Mieszko decides that the time has come to take what is his. His sights are set firmly on the south, the wealthy region of Silesia and Lesser Poland, including Krakow. These are critical trade hubs and highly fertile lands. But to wage war against the Bohemians, he desperately needs a secure rear in the west. Mieszko makes a move that absolutely shocks the European aristocracy. He marries again, this time to Oder, the daughter of the powerful German Margrave Dietrich. The massive problem was that Oder was a sworn nun. Mieszko literally drags her out of the monastery in Kalbe. By the strict standards of the era, this is blatant sacrilege, warranting immediate and unconditional excommunication from the church. But the German bishops conveniently close their eyes to it. Mieszko's formidable army makes him far too valuable an ally. It was highly advantageous for the empire to unleash the Polans against a rebellious Prague. Having secured German neutrality, Mieszko strikes. The Bohemian garrisons cannot withstand the crushing onslaught of the armored Polans. The prince strips away territories that Prague had tightly controlled for decades. The exact same people who had recently sent him cavalry and helped him win the Battle of Cedynia were now retreating behind the mountains under the relentless blows of his soldiers. By 990, Silesia becomes an integral part of Mieszko's state. Look at the map. In just 30 years, a man who started out as a localized chieftain in the woods around Poznan drew the boundaries of a state that almost perfectly mirror the borders of modern Poland. He repelled the violent assaults of the empire in the west, subjugated Pomerania in the north, and annexed Silesia in the south. But his life is drawing to a close. Mieszko is old and sick. His state is vast, but it possesses one glaring vulnerability. It holds together solely because of him, on the sheer terror inspired by his retinue and on his own personal oaths. The moment he dies, the neighbors will swarm in to tear the country to pieces, and it is then that Mieszko makes his final, most profoundly unorthodox decision. The old prince summons his scribes. He dictates a parchment document that will reach us under the title Dagome iudex. In this text, Mieszko does something that not a single ruler in Eastern Europe had ever done before him. He takes his entire country, from the Baltic Sea down to the southern mountains, with all its raging rivers, trade routes, and fortified cities, and he gives it away as a gift. But not to his son, not to the German emperor. He gifts Poland to St. Peter. The old prince summons his scribes. He dictates a document that will reach us under the title Dagome iudex. In this parchment, Mieszko does something that absolutely no one in these forests had ever done before. He takes his entire country. From the Baltic Sea to the southern mountains, with all its trade routes, forests, and fortresses. And he hands it over as a gift to St. Peter, meaning to the Pope in Rome. At first glance, this looks like the panicked act of an aging man who suddenly feared for his immortal soul and decided to simply buy divine forgiveness. But Mieszko remained a cold, calculating politician until his absolute final breath. This document is not a religious confession. It is a legally binding contract. By handing the lands over to the Pope, Mieszko formally transformed them into the direct property of the Holy See. Not a single Saxon margrave, not even the emperor himself, could now simply march in and annex these territories. An attack on the property of St. Peter meant a direct, open conflict with Rome and the very real threat of immediate excommunication. Mieszko erected a practically impenetrable legal barricade entirely around his borders. But the Dagome iudex had a second, equally important objective, an internal one. The text of the document lists the exact names on whose behalf the monumental gift is being made. Mieszko himself, his second wife Oder, and their young mutual sons. There is one very conspicuous name missing from this short list. Boleslav is nowhere to be found, the eldest son by Dobrava. That very same boy who once lived as a political hostage at the German court, but who had now grown up, matured, and was actively commanding armies. Why did Mieszko intentionally erase his firstborn from the most important document of his entire life? Historians offer a variety of theories. Perhaps he genuinely wanted to divide the country and protect his younger sons from the blazing ambitions of their older brother. Or perhaps, by that time, Boleslav had simply become far too independent, and the father used this method to totally cut him off from supreme power. We don't know exactly what the prince was thinking as he pressed the seal, but we absolutely know the ultimate outcome. This final, incredibly cunning plan of Mieszko's did not work. In 992, the first historically verified ruler of Poland dies, and the absolute second he is gone, Boleslav does exactly what his father feared most. He immediately exiles his stepmother, along with his half-brothers, from the country. He blinds anyone among the nobility who even attempts to stand in his way. And he seizes the entirety of the state solely for himself. A country, forged together by the pure iron will of one man, passes violently into the hands of another. Take a look at a map of 10th century Europe. There were dozens upon dozens of Slavic tribes out there. The Obotrites, the Lutici, the Heveli. They all had their own exceptionally brave chieftains, their own impregnable fortresses, their own gods, and their own grand victories. Where are they now? They vanished. They became nothing more than footnotes in dry Saxon chronicles. Their lands were completely swallowed whole by the empire. But the state of the Polans remained. This is the ultimate essence of what Mieszko accomplished. He survived and maintained absolute independence, not because he was the strongest force on the continent. He survived because he knew exactly when to adapt. When it was time to fight, he personally led the vanguard under the crushing lances of knights at Cedynia. When it was time to negotiate, he bowed deeply and sent the sword of his most hated enemy to the emperor. When he desperately needed Bohemian cavalry, he banished his wives, adopted a completely foreign god, and ordered his men to chop down the sacred oaks to which his ancestors had prayed for centuries. He wasn't building a perfect kingdom of divine light. He was building a state that could survive. The price was horrifying. The blood of his own people, peasants suffocated by crushing taxes, a young son handed over to foreign enemies just to buy a fleeting, temporary peace. Mieszko paid that price without a single second of hesitation. We often desperately want to see flawless, unblemished heroes in history, but real states are not born from beautiful legends. They are assembled from incredibly heavy compromises, sheer brutality, and cold, hard calculation. Mieszko was the very first of the forest chieftains to truly understand the rules of the grand European game. And he played it so masterfully that a full 1,000 years later, the borders of his country almost perfectly mirror the borders of modern Poland. In our next episode, we will talk about that very same erased eldest son, Boleslav the Brave, a man who refused to simply negotiate with the empire. He decided to challenge it directly.